Welcome to the Center for Student Learning Study Skills Workshop, Critical Thinking. My name is Melissa Wortman, and I am the Study Skills Coordinator in the Center for Student Learning, and I will be speaking today for this presentation. We will be looking at what critical thinking is, how it facilitates metacognition, and how you can use it in the studying process. Critical thinking is a key aspect to retention and acing your tests, so be sure to really challenge your thinking throughout this presentation to move forward to a more critical thinking approach.
NYU did this really great study on critical thinking, complex reasoning, and written communications within the university systems in this country. And what they wanted to find out is whether or not these undergrad students are learning what they need to know when it comes to critical thinking, when it comes to reasoning, when it comes to written communication. And what they discovered is that students aren't getting the education necessary to excel in these areas. Okay, so this is a very extensive study. They decided to interview about 2,322 students. And what they did is at first, they interviewed students in the first 2 years of their undergrad education, and then they interviewed students, or tested students, I should say, after 4 years of undergraduate education. And what they found out that 45% of students made no significant improvement in their critical thinking, reasoning, or writing skills during the first 2 years of college, according to the study. After 4 years, 36% showed no significant gains in these so-called higher order thinking skills. What they found was that students will purposely take classes that they know will not force them to think critically. Okay, so a good example of that is ratemyprofessor.com. And look, I'm guilty of that too. I loved ratemyprofessor.com. I went on that website all the time to see whether or not a teacher was too difficult, too easy, what was the grade that the teacher got. And if a professor was known to be very difficult, I would steer clear.
I really think that if you haven't done any critical thinking your whole life and you try to start at 18, it's not a good place to start. We need to have people think critically at an early age, at a very early age. But that's not really something that's cultivated or encouraged in our culture. You know, we like to, just, you know, we get the signals from everywhere. I mean, from the media, our politicians, our so-called leaders. It's never to challenge the system. It's always to kind of not make waves and to go along to get along. And you know, after a lifetime of that, all of a sudden you go to college and you're going to be a critical thinker out of the blue. I just don't see it happening.
And I think it's disastrous when it comes to the political realm where people don't understand and they can't pick up on the simplest of themes. But I don't know if it's a direct result from schools not teaching or things being stripped down from them. I mean, people choose to do what they want to do. I mean, can you do algebra anymore? We stop doing it when we need to stop doing it, when we don't need to get that grade in 6th grade anymore, you know? Or then if you're gonna be an engineer and you get to college, you're gonna take all your physics classes and all these extra high science classes because you need to. It's just, I still think it goes along the lines of what you ended up taking, and it sucks because everyone, no matter how smart you are, well, not everyone, but a lot of people, say the majority of people have ignorance in certain aspects of
But critical
their
thinking
life.
is something that's necessary for all fields
It's
of
just
work.
a matter of just thinking. People don't, the problem is people don't think. People don't, common sense is a rare thing now. So the problem, no one actually listens. I don't know how you teach listening. It's just because they're getting flooded so much. And when it comes to political arguments, it gets flooded so much with emotion. Like, so look at this guy. You scared of him yet? Don't vote for him. You know what he said? And just lied to people. Because no one actually analyzes what they get in their brain.
Do you think the newscasters are correct in saying colleges are not making students critically think? We will get more into what critical thinking is and how you can achieve it in the next few slides. Let's start out with a very simple question. What is critical thinking? I want you to first formulate an answer for this question before we move on so we can see if your definition changes at all as we go through this presentation. So take a moment to think about what you feel is critical thinking. We can see how critical thinking and higher level thinking fits into the larger scheme of things by looking at Bloom's taxonomy. This triangle was created to show how, as you move up the triangle, there is a deeper level of thinking and processing happening. Take a moment to read through each of the levels to gain a better understanding of what kind of skills are used at each level. You can see the same triangle from the last slide on the left side. However, now Create is at the top due to research in the past few years changing the order of the levels. This is then compared to the triangle on the right side, explaining more of how thinking changes as you go up the triangle. The middle two levels are where you should be at in the undergraduate college level: skills and concepts and strategic thinking. Each of these can be applied to all of your courses and how your professors are challenging you to think a different and deeper way with readings, assignments, and tests. Here the levels are labeled for you. Again, this is an old triangle with evaluation instead of Create at the top. You can see in high school you should be memorizing and restating information. A lot of this thinking does not take much effort or challenge. In undergrad, you should be solving problems, transforming theories into practical situations, making connections, and identifying components throughout analysis. This kind of thinking takes effort on your end, where you cannot just take information for what it is without thinking about it. There's a lot of critical thinking that needs to happen to get to these levels, and now you can see why there is such a jump from high school to college because of how thinking becomes much deeper and much more work. Knowledge is no longer just taken and regurgitated. You must transform it and use it for application, which in turn is much more challenging. You can see in grad school the levels are much more advanced, making connections with understanding and creativity. Critical thinking is used on each of these levels. It is a very important component to being successful in college and beyond as your thinking deepens. In the first section, we will talk about the facilitation of critical thinking through metacognition. I want to first pose the question of what is the difference between studying and learning. Is there a difference? Do you think one, if either, is more enjoyable? Studying sounds like a daunting task with views of a student sitting over a book in a fluorescent lit room, while learning sounds like an interactive process where the student is maybe drawing graphs or talking with other students. Learning in that aspect sounds much more enjoyable. If you simply change your way of thinking about sitting down to look through class material from studying to learning, it can be a much more enjoyable process. You can change your thinking from studying to learning by using metacognition while looking at class materials. Metacognition will help you to think about your own thinking, as well as studying to learn and not just make the grade. Metacognition is being conscious of your consciousness as you are learning. Have you ever thought about what you were thinking about and if you were actually retaining it? Or do you feel like you may be going through the motions a lot of the time? Using metacognition, you can learn and retain more information more effectively. Metacognition is 4 main points for you to focus on. Metacognition is really your ability to think about your own thinking. This is much of what I talked about in the last slide. Metacognition is also the ability to be consciously aware of oneself as a problem solver. This makes your learning much more than taking in information for a later time. This means you can make connections, resolve questions, solve problems, and many other things with material you are learning. Metacognition is the ability to monitor and control your mental processing. You are much more powerful than you think you are. You can control your mental processing by taking time to be sure you understand concepts, see connections, and answer all of your questions. Lastly, metacognition is the ability to accurately judge your level of learning. Again, you can take time to be sure you have learned, how much you have learned, and if you actually understand and can make connections with what you have learned. This is a large piece to critical thinking because you need to be sure the time spent sitting and learning is worth it, challenging yourself to think about the material and not just go through the motions. Now I'm going to give your metacognition a test. In the next slide, I will show you a list of words. I will give you about 15 seconds to look at these words and memorize them. Go. How many words or phrases do you remember? Can you say all of them? Was there anything interesting about that list of words? What were they arranged according to? As you can see in the list of phrases, they were arranged in numerical order. Now that you know this, I will give you a second chance to memorize them again. Go! Now, how many words or phrases do you remember? What do you think were the two major differences between the first attempt and the second attempt? There was two major differences between the first attempt and the second attempt, hopefully making the second attempt much easier. We, 1, knew what the task was, and 2, knew how the information was organized. By knowing these two main points, you were able to hopefully memorize many more words in the second round. Critical thinking while using metacognition is just this. It is finding out how the information is important and then drawing connections between the information so it all makes sense. The next section is the facilitation of critical thinking through the studying process. Now we are back to learning instead of studying, and there are three main points about learning that has to do with critical thinking. The first is that passive learning is an oxymoron. It is not actually possible to passively learn. Active learning is much more lasting, valuable, and efficient than passive learning. This is because thinking about thinking is important, just like we discussed in the last section with metacognition. We now see the value in metacognition by that one simple activity. We can also tie this back to Bloom's taxonomy, the triangles in the beginning we looked at, because the level at which learning occurs is very important, and we will see why in the next slide. Here's a simple graph that looks at the learning process, which involves studying. And we will use the word studying because you may be more familiar with using this word. You can see in the graph, as you do more with material, it should build on the last and grow your knowledge in the topic area. Between the steps, you see review and assess, which helps you look back at the material to check your progress on learning it, like we discussed in metacognition. I should note that this is a process. It takes time and multiple times of seeing the material to learn it, to be able to use it on an application test, which most of your professors give. Take a moment to look through each of the steps and think about what level of thinking is involved with each. In the next 2 slides, we will look at how memory and retention impact this process. Here are some things we know about memory as it pertains to the learning process. There are 3 basic parts of memory: attention, storage, and retrieval. You need to have stored content to be able to critically think about information. This is because you need to be able to understand information and draw connections between what you know. We know we want information to be stored in the long-term memory to be able to retrieve it at a much later time, such as finals or comps. As you move through the learning process, you will move information deeper into the storage, so you will be able to retrieve it at a later time. Each of memory's basic parts are very important to the learning process and critically thinking. Here are some things we know about retention as it pertains to the learning process. As you are studying, you can only have about 15 working items in your frontal lobe at a time, which means you need to take breaks as you are studying, and different levels of studying like we saw in the learning process graph. The working items as you study is the attention stage in memory, and the time away helps with the storage of the material. Experience is used in retention by using material to make connections and relate to it. This can help you effectively remember much more information for a longer period of time. Retention and the way it works with memory is very important to the critical thinking process. The last section is a revisit of the facilitation of critical thinking through critically thinking. I want to ask you again to see if your definition of critical thinking has changed. What is critical thinking? Hopefully you now have a better understanding of what critical thinking is and how you can use it on a daily basis. Before we end this presentation, I want to leave you with some questions and actions to take with all of this newly learned information. What ideas from this presentation will you take with you today? How can you implement these ideas into your academic life? I hope you can find something from this presentation to use in your learning and thinking this semester and the rest of your journey here at CFC. That concludes the Critical Thinking Workshop. If you have any further questions about this workshop or the content, please come to or contact the Center for Student Learning at 843-953-5635. We are located on the first floor of the Addlestone Library off of Calhoun Street and are also mobile at csl.cfc.edu. Please take a look at our other videos available for other topics and handouts as a resource. We hope to see you in the CSL soon.